want to have my students working really hard, making sure that they're developing this work ethic while still being extremely kind and welcoming. That's a tightrope that you have to walk as a woman science professor. Students won't accept you not being kind, so you have to be that. You can't ever be cold. Not ever. Like, you can't have a bad day. As I said in my previous video on this topic, student evaluations are an invaluable resource that really help us sort out what we like and don't like about our pedagogy, what is working and what is not working. So I don't want to downplay the importance of student evaluations. First of all, it's important that students eventually have a voice if they're frustrated with how a class went or how a professor was and so on. It's important that they have some kind of an outlet for that information. But at the same time, I will also say that, this works against women. It works against BIPOC people and it works against women. And this has been proven many times, and I talk about this in the previous video. Before I get into my own student evaluation through the years, I wanted to talk specifically about the class that I primarily teach at this time, which is Anatomy and Physiology. This is my bread and butter course. I have been teaching A&P for about 20 years now, and there are a few specific challenges in teaching a class like this. First of all, it has a reputation for being a difficult class, but nonetheless, we have students take it in their very first semester, oftentimes, of college. So you have the double hit for students that they have to take this intensive science class right away, and oftentimes as they're getting used to college life. At the college where I currently teach at Carthage, most of my students are first-year students, and so they are oftentimes getting settled into the dorm life. And, they're literally 18 years old, literally the first time they're living away from home. Most of our student population is basically a traditional student such as that. So along with the stress of living away from home and getting used to dorm life and roommates and the cafeteria food and all those kind of things, they're also taking this class. And to be fair, and not to be condescending at all, but just to be factual, students are still in somewhat of a high school mentality sometimes, and we're trying to break them out of that habit to understand that they have to be a lot more independent in their studying, again, as they're taking this very difficult science class. But it is also an important job. This is the first step that they have to move on to their healthcare careers. We have students who are pre-med, pre-PT, pre-OT. Nursing has always been a big portion of my student population because every school that I've worked at where I teach A&P also has a very large nursing program. And so this becomes an important part of their pedagogy. And basically, we have to ensure that it's appropriate for them to move on to the next level, and which oftentimes involves even more difficult science classes. So we want to make sure that it's appropriate for them to pass through our class, through A&P, before they move on, because otherwise, quite frankly, just putting it out there, it's a waste of tuition dollars and it's a waste of time if you don't actually belong in that program. Sometimes students will unfortunately move on to the second year of their program and encounter classes, pathophysiology and pharmacology and even more difficult classes than that, and all of a sudden they're just lost because they did not have the good experience in their first year in A&P to make sure that they actually were going to be able to be successful in those higher level science classes. So for a number of reasons, it's an essential class. It's an essential class. Many professors actually don't continue teaching A&P after their first year, or maybe even after their first semester, or sometimes after their first few weeks. They'll just stop teaching it because it's an intensive experience for the students, of course, but if you think about it, that means it's a really intensive experience for the professor who has to simply know this huge list of, structures in the body and get to know them really well, have encyclopedic knowledge of the structures of the body, but also there's a lot of conceptual work that, first of all, you have to know it really well as a professor, and then you have to turn it around and be able to teach it. So it's a really intensive class. It's usually 2 semesters long, and so it's an entire academic year of knowing all of this stuff and also understanding how to teach it and how to get it across. So, since this class is specifically about student evaluations, thought I would start off by talking about my very first semester teaching anatomy and physiology. And to be clear, I've taught other classes through the years as well. I've taught general biology classes, genetics, genetic lab for years. I've taught an evolution class, I taught neurobiology classes, and a few other things as well that I'm actually forgetting at this moment. Oh, microbiology. I've taught other biology classes, but this is sort of my specialty at this point, is teaching this particular class. I started off, I would say, about 2004, teaching at a community college, and this was around the time that I also met my husband because he was working at this college. My first semester teaching A&P, I'd already been teaching general biology classes and kind of leading up and saying, I want to specialize and teach something a little bit more. My first semester teaching A&P was absolutely abysmal. And truth be told, I didn't actually read my student evaluations that semester because I just didn't want to do that to myself. I knew they were going to be really bad. So I turned them over to my husband to read them, or at the time my boyfriend to read them, because I knew that he would give it to me straight if there was something really important that I had to work on, like he'd be able to sort through there. But I did not want to read that level of negativity in my student eval. So that's the one semester I never read my student evaluations. I may have them somewhere. Maybe I should like open them up and read them someday. I don't know. Well, I worked really hard through the years to improve my teaching, of course, and improve my understanding of the class and the material that I needed to get across to my students, and improved my own and started developing my own style of teaching this class. Today, the course is pretty darn good. I can say that objectively. I know this to be true because I have taken just boatloads of information that I know about the course and how to teach the course, and I've put it together into something that ensures that students are actively learning the course, basically problem-based learning every single day, all day long. And I give them the tools to do this. They basically create their own textbook, all right? Well, that's an uncomfortable situation. Not only am I asking them to like read a textbook, but they actually have to create it themselves. So students have to buy into that. It's pretty uncomfortable to be thrown into an exercise where you're being told, now you have to draw, excitation, contraction, coupling. Draw that for me now. That's really uncomfortable. You'd rather just look at a picture of excitation, contraction, coupling. But what I've learned through the years, of course, and if you think about it, it makes sense. It's easy to miss some of the details about those structures if you're not actually producing them yourself. So my class is all about the problem-based learning. It's all about creating figures and drawing things and drawing all of the details in. Students do learn a lot from this process. They learn big picture and extremely detailed work. But they do have to buy into it. It's pretty demanding on them. It's hours and hours of studying every week. The good side of it, of course, is that I do tell them exactly what they need to do. They need to put the hours in still, but there's no mystery here. Like, they know exactly what's expected of them and exactly what they're going to be tested on, for example. I'm not afraid to give appropriate scores. I have an objective grading scale, and I give grades fairly early on. They get a score every single day for a quiz. They get many exams throughout the semester, so that we're able to immediately pull out and say, okay, this is where you need to be doing a little bit more work. This is what I would suggest doing. There's lots of opportunities like that. And I do offer lots and lots of support. A good portion of my daily class is actually review to make sure they are practicing things that they're supposed to practice. I set aside time every single class period so that we have plenty of time to practice what we just learned, and we draw together. Every semester I strive to have a tutor who has taken my class before and kind of understands the ins and outs of the course and is able to guide students. When I cannot guide them, then they can meet with my tutor. And there's just tons and tons of material available to them online if they cannot meet with my tutor or myself, they will have the opportunity to engage with this stuff online as well. So yes, I was inexperienced at first, but at this point, I've shifted the way that I've approached the course about 4 or 5 different times. I've done major overhauls in exactly how I want things to go, and I'm always striving to make information more amenable for students to be able to pick it up more easily, because I do understand that it's difficult. The reality is I can only be there for them so much. They do need to spend time independently trying to figure out how they themselves are going to pick up on this information as best they can. They need to find their own style of learning the course as I'm, finding my style of teaching it. Whenever I shift my course, whenever I shift my pedagogy and add on something new, it is a massive time suck for me personally. It is hours and hours of work every week, not just doing the regular job, but creating this new way of developing the course. It would probably be about 10 extra hours every week working and working to make sure this material is available. So for example, if one semester I decided I'm going to make sure that students have practice quizzes so that every single time they have a lecture, they can take a practice quiz, and I need to do that for every single, I can't just do that for a couple of lessons here and there. Once students see something like that, they really like that type of, like, okay, now I have the ability to turn over the material in my own time. They're going to want that for every single unit. So it's a year-long process of making sure every week that I'm developing this material and doing it well, and thinking about what they really need versus so that it's useful for them, so that they're not wasting their time doing these practice quizzes, just as an example. So it's constant work, it's hard work, it's tedious, it's very effortful, and therefore I must say that it's pretty shocking when I find out that some professors, not a lot anymore, but there are some professors who are pretty old school, and they don't make material available to their students. So why do I work so hard? Well, first of all, I want to keep my job. That would be great. But it's kind of just the right thing to do. I want to make sure that students understand the material well, and that they are appropriately moving on to the next level. I want them to succeed. I don't want them to be filtered out of my class. I want them to have this opportunity to move on to the next level. And also, it just makes it a lot more interesting for me. As hard work as it is, I like to work hard, and I like to better my pedagogy and my own understanding of the material. So before I get into student evaluations, I thought I would talk about general complaints, when a student will go over my head and complain about my teaching, either to my chair or to my dean. Sometimes they go all the way to the president of the college, but just so you know, those complaints just come back to the chair anyway, so you might as well just start with the chair. You're thinking about writing and being dramatic by writing directly to the president or the board or whatever. They're just going to throw it back to the chair. Some students, probably once a year still to this day, maybe once every 2 years these days, but I've gotten used to it. I've gotten used to students complaining about me and going over my head. At least on 2 occasions, students went to the trouble of writing a petition about me and getting their fellow classmates to sign it. I've never been shown these petitions. I don't know exactly what they said or who signed it, of course, but I probably something like this professor shouldn't be working here anymore. I'm laughing about it. I shouldn't be laughing about it. It's just like, now that I'm pretty confident in my class work and how hard that I work and what I'm bringing to my students and making sure that they succeed, I am pretty confident saying that I work really hard for this class. I strive to be very professional while still being, like that, walking that tightrope of, I want to have my students working really hard, making sure that they're developing this work ethic while still being extremely kind and welcoming. That's a tightrope that you have to walk as a woman science professor. Students won't accept you not being kind, so you have to be that. You can't ever be cold. Not ever. Like, you can't have a bad day. For the most part, I just want to do what's right for my students. The fact that my students sometimes complain about me, well, it used to hurt my feelings. At this point, I'm going to say, yeah, I'm doing my job. My chair and my dean are well aware of my teaching system and that it's not easy and that students sometimes have a hard time with it. I think they know me pretty well as a person. The pandemic was a disaster. There were lots of curveballs thrown at us. It was really hard to be a good professor through that, I will say. My student complaints ratcheted up during that time, that's for sure. I made some rookie mistakes in there. I was kind of oftentimes just really confused about how exactly I was going to continue to teach students online. To come to the point here, maybe these complaints specifically are directed at me because I'm a woman. Maybe especially we get complaints when we're women. And if you're rolling your eyes right now, hear me out. I want to talk about my parallel job as an academic advisor. So, as a professor, I don't allow my students to complain about any other professors. It's just, I don't want to get into the middle of anything. I always tell them, like, if they ask for my advice, of course, I would tell them just to go back to the professor. If they're really unhappy, then I might direct them to a chair or something like that. That might be a reasonable thing. But I never allow them to complain. There's a number of us teaching this same class in different sections of the same class. And so sometimes it seems like students might want to play us against each other or something like that. I won't allow it. It's just not a good idea. That's a long-standing policy of mine. But as an academic advisor, it is actually partially my job to make sure that I'm listening to students. Sometimes I'll get random emails in the middle of the semester or in our every academic advisee meets with their advisor every semester to plan the classes for the next semester, and then kind of talk about where they're at and talk about their GPA or like classes they've struggled with and so on. So sometimes in that role, sometimes I do hear complaints about other professors. And through the years, I've probably had about 300 academic advisees. You start to see a pattern. As a student complaining about a professor, it certainly seems real, like whatever complaint is valid. And I'm not invalidating any complaints that come my way. I'm not. But I do start to see patterns that are specific to women. First of all, if a student is unhappy about a class that's being taught by a male professor, oftentimes they'll allude to the professor but won't name them, or they'll talk they'll talk about the class and how difficult the class is. But if they're unhappy with a woman professor, they will name her. They will talk about her personally. They will use words like vindictive, resentful. They will talk like the one that you hear oftentimes is, "This professor doesn't like me." That's a comment that my students sometimes say about me. I assure you, I like all of my students fine, or I'm just neutral about them, which maybe sometimes that can come across as me not liking them. I don't know. In the past, sometimes I've had really big classes, and if a student never raises their hand and never says anything in class, chances are good I actually don't know. Like, I don't force students to participate in class. If they don't want to, they don't want to. That's fine. Sometimes students in that situation I'll tell that they think I don't like them. I don't know how that happens, but anyway. So anyway, since I've seen so many other women in the same position where students are specifically talking about them and complaining about them, like their own personalities sometimes, I take it a little less personal that students sometimes complain about me in that way. So in some ways, it's kind of helpful to have gotten that. In my opinion, it seems like imperfections are not allowed for women professors. Imperfections, mistakes, it's almost triggering to me when I see people out there in the world saying, "Oh, it's important to make mistakes, haha. It's important to make mistakes as part of the creative process," because I swear, every time I make a mistake, my students come down on me hard. I'll see it in my evaluations, or I'll see it in complaints to the chair. Women, to a certain extent, are not allowed to make mistakes. Imperfections are not allowed. Not allowed. I think it's tempting to try to sort out why women tend to be treated this way by their students. The study from the previous video that I made on this topic about the grading backlash, that resonated with me. I think it might have something to do with that, when women demand that students work hard or they're going to get a particular grade. Like, you're going to get a C minus from me unless students don't like that, and women tend to be downgraded much more than their male counterparts doing exactly the same thing. So the grading backlash seems to be part of it, but I think that still doesn't really answer the question why. Maybe it's just that that line that is always drawn across women's behavior, that we really need women to be kind, caring, generous, and we don't like it when women step out of that set of behaviors, because what we need, we kind of intrinsically understand this about ourselves, that if women aren't willing to be kind and giving and generous for 20 years of their life, like giving up productive years of their life, then who's going to raise the children in our society? And I think that that's a fear, that's a genuine fear that has some validity to it. It makes sense. So I'm not a psychologist. I'm not going to try to speculate on that, but that's kind of just my opinion, and kind of what I've seen through the years is that we just really need women to be kind and generous and giving, because that's what we need out of women. That's what we continue to need if we're going to move forward as a society, to be honest. Truth be told, the why doesn't matter. We still haven't really established the what yet. I'm just at the point where I'm trying to get people to understand that this is a real thing, that this is definitely something that is true. I see it all the time. And again, as I said in the previous video, study after study after study after study shows that women are treated in a particular way by their students. So let's get into student evaluation.